What if the true power of a medieval king was never measured by the crowns he wore, the castles he ruled, or the armies he commanded, but by the way he treated the enemies who had already fallen at his feet? What if the moment of victory, the moment when mercy should have spoken louder than steel, was precisely when the darkest side of royalty emerged? Imagine standing inside a torchlit hall, the air thick with smoke and anticipation, watching a defeated enemy dragged before a ruler whose smile reveals more cruelty than triumph. Courts that had witnessed decades of war, famine, and plague still whispered in terror about what some kings did after the battle was already won. And the question that echoes through the centuries is as unsettling now as it was then. Why did these rulers reserve their most shocking punishments not for the battlefield, but for moments when their victims were powerless? Medieval chronicles rarely reveal everything, but between the lines lies a world where brutality became political theater. Kings understood that violence delivered in public view could reshape loyalty, obedience, and fear more effectively than any royal decree. The throne was not just a seat of command. It was a stage where calculated cruelty taught lessons no subject dared forget. And in that stagecraft of domination, defeated enemies became tools, symbols, and warnings. What happened inside those stone halls was not random savagery. It was strategy crafted to leave scars not only on flesh, but on memory. The spectacle often began the moment the enemy was captured. Shackled, exposed, and humiliated, they entered a world built on rituals that blended intimidation with psychological warfare. Some kings forced their rivals to bow until their muscles trembled. Others ordered them paraded through cities that had once feared their power. Every gesture, every blow, every word spoken in those moments served a purpose. The court watched in silence, body tense, knowing the king's next move would reveal the true extent of his authority. And sometimes, even the most loyal noblemen felt their stomachs twist as they realized that the same cruelty directed at a defeated foe could easily be turned on anyone who displeased the crown. These punishments were designed to spread like wildfire through villages, provinces, and borders. A mutilated traitor sent back to his homeland was worth more to a king than any messenger. A rival forced to live in disgrace as a living monument of defeat could terrify more effectively than an army stationed at the frontier. What looks like senseless brutality to us today was, in the medieval mind, a calculated performance meant to secure dominance through fear that lingered long after the blood dried. And you, witnessing this from the shadows of the Great Hall, might find yourself wondering what you would do in the presence of such raw, merciless authority. Would you speak? Would you kneel? Or would you simply pray that the king's gaze never found you? These rituals of domination reveal something essential about medieval power. Victory was never enough. Kings needed their enemies broken, reshaped, erased, or displayed, because fear was a currency more valuable than gold. If you feel the weight of this truth, if you sense how the threads of fear and authority wove together to build entire empires, then share your thoughts below. Tell me what part of this shocked you most. Leave a like to help this story reach more people who want to understand the hidden reality behind medieval power, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next in this unfolding narrative. Because the next chapter of this story dives even deeper into the machinery of control that shaped an entire era. When a medieval king prepared to punish a defeated enemy, the act was rarely impulsive. It was engineered, crafted with the same precision used to plan military campaigns and political alliances. Behind every brutal display, there was a deeper architecture of intent, a psychological mechanism designed to shape the perception of power in everyone who witnessed it. The cruelty was not merely physical, it was symbolic, layered with meaning, meant to echo through castles and villages alike. Kings understood that ruling through fear required more than the swing of a blade. It required the creation of rituals that turned punishment into performance and suffering into a form of communication. The enemy who stood bound before the throne was no longer a person, but a living message written in the language of terror. What happened next depended on the strategy behind the king's fury. Some rulers preferred to break the mind before breaking the body, allowing silence, suspense, and the slow realization of doom to do the first wave of damage. A captive might be paraded through the corridors of the castle, forced to walk past courtiers who avoided eye contact, not out of pity, but out of sheer terror of being associated with failure. In these corridors, the enemy absorbed a truth more devastating than chains. They were stepping into a world engineered to erase them. The monarchy operated like a vast psychological apparatus, and every soldier, servant, and noble played a role in reinforcing its authority. The king's intent was not simply to punish, but to reconstruct the enemy's identity piece by piece. When a ruler demanded that a captured rival kneel, for example, the act was more than humiliation. It was the symbolic destruction of sovereignty. To kneel before a king who was once an opponent was to admit before dozens of witnesses that the hierarchy of power had shifted permanently. Even before any physical punishment began, the ritual of submission transformed the captive from a threat into an object of royal control. Some kings prolonged this phase deliberately, forcing the enemy to listen as courtiers described the consequences of rebellion or recounted the fate of those who had defied the crown before. The psychological weight of these stories carved deeper wounds than any iron instrument could. At the heart of this system was a principle medieval rulers knew instinctively. Fear grows stronger when it is predictable enough to be dreaded, but unpredictable enough to inspire uncertainty. A king might spare one rival unexpectedly, only to destroy another for the slightest offense, creating an atmosphere where loyalty became a matter of survival rather than devotion. Courts lived in a state of constant vigilance, reading the king's temper the way astronomers read the stars, searching for signs of danger. Even when no punishment was occurring, the memory of past brutality hovered like smoke in the throne room. Every noble carried a mental image of what happened to those who failed. That image kept them obedient. The enemy standing before the king understood this as well, and as they waited for the first blow, the first command, or the first public humiliation, they were already being reshaped by the system. The king's control over their fate extended far beyond the dungeon or the execution yard. It reached into their sense of dignity, identity, and hope. They were not simply facing punishment, but entering a psychological landscape designed to erase every trace of defiance. And what happened next would carve itself into the memories of everyone who watched, strengthening the king's aura in ways that victory on the battlefield alone never could. The moment a defeated enemy was brought before a medieval king, the ritual of humiliation began with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. It wasn't enough for the ruler to demonstrate that victory had been achieved. He needed to show that dominance could be reshaped into spectacle. The court gathered not merely to witness punishment, but to observe the transformation of a once powerful rival into a symbol of absolute submission. These ceremonies served as mirrors for the kingdom, reflecting the consequences of rebellion and the authority of the crown in a way no decree or proclamation could. Every detail, the posture of the captive, the silence of the hall, the unblinking stares of the nobles, was part of a performance engineered to influence how power was understood. The ritual often began with forced exposure. A captured lord who once rode into battle surrounded by banners and loyal men was now stripped of the symbols that defined him. His armor removed, his cloak torn, away even his hair or beard. Marks of status and identity might be cut to signal his fall. In medieval society, appearance was more than vanity. It was a language of rank. To alter it meant to rewrite the captive's very place in the social order. Some kings had their rivals placed in rags, others forced them to wear grotesque costumes, turning a former threat into a mockery of himself. These humiliations weren't random acts of cruelty. They recalibrated the hierarchy in real time, reminding everyone in the hall who controlled the meaning of honor. When the captive was finally made to walk through the great hall, the room became a silent theater. Courtiers watched as the enemy was forced to lower his head, to stumble, to stand in positions that displayed vulnerability rather than strength. Even the distance between the captive and the throne was significant. A long, deliberate walk emphasized the loss of autonomy with every step. Servants and guards positioned along the path made no effort to hide their disdain, and the defeated rival felt the weight of dozens of eyes measuring the depth of his fall. This moment was designed to break not only the spirit of the enemy, but also the memory of his former stature in the minds of those who watched. Then came the verbal degradation. Kings used words as weapons, delivering accusations and insults meant to pierce deeper than any blade. They reminded the defeated of broken alliances, past boasts, failed strategies. Each sentence a deliberate strike aimed at crushing whatever pride remained. Some rulers forced the enemy to confess their failures publicly, turning their voice into a tool of their own destruction. Others demanded that the captive praise the king's wisdom or acknowledge the futility of resistance. The act of speaking under duress made the humiliation complete, imprinting the idea that the king's authority extended even into the thoughts and speech of the vanquished. But the most devastating part of the ritual was the court's reaction, or lack of one. No gasps, no murmurs, no expressions of pity. Everyone present knew that a single sympathetic glance could be interpreted as defiance. Even close allies of the defeated stood motionless, unwilling to risk their own safety by showing loyalty to someone who had already fallen. This silent complicity deepened the captive's isolation, making it clear that they had become an object, not a person. In that stillness, the king demonstrated not only his power to punish, but his ability to control the emotions of his entire court. By the time the ritual of humiliation reached its final stage, the enemy was already transformed. Whatever punishment came next, whether imprisonment, mutilation, servitude, or death, was merely the physical expression of a psychological conquest that had already been achieved. And everyone in the hall understood that the true lesson wasn't directed at the enemy at all, it was directed at them, a reminder that the throne's authority reached into the deepest corners of their own fears. Once humiliation had stripped a defeated enemy of dignity, medieval kings moved to a phase of punishment designed not only to harm the body, but to imprint terror on the collective imagination of the realm. These were not impulsive acts of cruelty. They were structured, rehearsed, and engineered to send a message that would ripple through generations. A king understood that the body of a rival was more than flesh. It was a canvas on which authority could be written, and every cut, burn, or brand delivered a lesson intended to outlive the victim. The aim was not simply to destroy a man, but to reshape the kingdom's understanding of power through the spectacle of irreversible suffering. The first tactic many kings favored was mutilation, chosen with clinical precision. Removing a nose or ear might seem less dramatic than execution, but in medieval society, disfigurement was a social death sentence. A nobleman, without a recognizable face, could not command troops, rule land, or negotiate alliances. His altered appearance became a permanent reminder of the king's dominance, a visible warning that rebellion carried consequences that followed a person everywhere. Some rulers ordered the cutting of hamstrings, ensuring the enemy would live but never again walk without pain. The body became a living prophecy of what defiance produced. Other kings preferred punishments that fused physical agony with symbolic meaning. Branding the forehead with symbols of treason or disgrace turned the enemy into a marked object, a creature defined entirely by their failure. Some rulers carved emblems of their house onto the captive's skin, transforming the defeated man into a literal possession. These marks weren't merely wounds, they were territorial claims, declarations engraved into flesh. To the court watching, each strike of the iron wasn't just the torment of one enemy, it was the reinforcement of a hierarchy that placed the king beyond question. Still others chose punishments that were deliberately theatrical, combining pain with spectacle. A rival might be forced to stand exposed before the court, while the king narrated each stage of the punishment, transforming suffering into a lesson. Sometimes audiences were invited to watch closely, to observe how power could break a body with deliberate patience. The smell of burning flesh, the sound of chains dragging across stone, the gasp of the punished man. Every sensory detail deepened the memory, ensuring the example would not fade. Courts learned that loyalty wasn't merely expected, it was mandatory, reinforced through the suffering of others. But perhaps the most disturbing part of these punishments was the psychological dimension woven into them. A king often forced a captive to watch another prisoner suffer the fate he might soon meet. The enemy stood helpless as others screamed, understanding each moment that his own turn was coming. This anticipation carved deeper fear than the punishment itself. Kings knew that dread was more powerful than pain, and they wielded that insight with precision. When the enemy finally faced his own sentence, he did so already shattered, his resistance drained long before the first blow landed. For the court, these punishments served as anchors for obedience. The nobles might not speak of their fear openly, but it shaped every decision they made, every word they uttered in the presence of the crown. The king's brutality rippled outward, restructuring the boundaries of acceptable thought. Even rumors of such punishments could keep distant lords from plotting rebellion, reminding them that the king's reach extended beyond the battlefield and into the sanctity of their own bodies. And as these punishments unfolded, the throne room became a theater where fear was both the script and the audience. Every noble saw themselves in the suffering of the defeated. Every lord understood the message carved into bone and flesh. A king who punished without hesitation was a king who would not be challenged, and this knowledge settled like cold iron in the minds of those who served him. If anything in this depiction made you reflect on how power reshapes human behavior, share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective adds depth to understanding how these brutal rituals shaped entire eras of fear and authority. When a king chose not to kill a defeated enemy, it was rarely an act of mercy. In the medieval world, sparing a rival often carried a meaning far darker than execution. Death was final, but captivity allowed the king to reshape the identity of an enemy into something useful, humiliating, or symbolic. A defeated lord could be transformed into living property, a reminder of the throne's power that walked, breathed, and existed solely for the ruler's benefit. In these moments, the king became an architect of fate, determining not just how a man would die, but how he would live, and how that living would serve the crown. One of the most common fates for a captured nobleman was forced servitude within the royal household. A former commander who once issued orders with confidence might now spend his days cleaning equipment, tending horses, carrying messages, or performing the lowest forms of labor. This degradation worked on two levels. It reduced the enemy to a tool stripped of all honor, and it provided the court with a visible reminder that the king could take any man, regardless of birth, and bend him into submission. Servitude was more than physical toil. It was a reprogramming of identity, the slow erosion of self-respect under the weight of endless tasks. Some kings took this transformation further, forcing their enemies into roles meant to mock their former status. A captured prince might be dressed in bright colors and made to dance for the court, or a rival lord might be seated near the king's table only to be ridiculed before all guests. These performances became twisted court entertainment, a spectacle where the once powerful were displayed as curiosities. The message was unmistakable. The king controlled not only bodies and lands, but narratives, rewriting the story of a man's life for all to see. In those moments, the throne became a place where dignity could be stolen and rewritten at will. Others preferred to keep their enemies close, in roles that were halfway between servant and hostage. A defeated rival might be assigned as a companion to the king's children, a symbolic gesture that allowed the ruler to monitor him closely, while also reminding him how far he had fallen. Under constant watch, stripped of privacy, the captive learned to live in a state where every word and movement was evaluated. The psychological strain was immense. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and soon the enemy no longer knew where loyalty ended and fear began. By keeping the captive alive, the king gained a tool far more valuable than a corpse, a living testament to his dominance. Some captives were forced into roles of strategic humiliation. A rival might be paraded during diplomatic meetings, shown to foreign emissaries as an example of what happened to those who opposed the crown. He might be compelled to act as an interpreter, a scribe, or a witness, always present, always silent, always reminding others of the consequences of challenging royal authority. His presence alone became a warning, a symbol, woven into the political theater of negotiations and alliances. For a king, the value of a captive lay in the ongoing redefinition of power. Keeping an enemy alive allowed the ruler to project strength without lifting a weapon. Each day the captive served, he reinforced the idea that the king's power extended beyond death into the very framework of a man's existence. Whereas execution created a martyr or a story, captivity created a living narrative shaped by the king's will. And in a world where reputation often outweighed reality, that living narrative held immense political weight. These transformations revealed something profound about medieval monarchy. Power was not only about control of land or armies. It was about the ability to rewrite the meaning of a man's life. When a king declared that a rival was no longer a threat, but a servant, no longer a leader, but an object, no longer an equal, but a tool, he reshaped the political landscape without drawing a sword. The defeated enemy became a shadow, stripped of identity, surviving in a world where his existence served as an extension of the king's authority. And for those watching from the safety of the court, that transformation was more terrifying than any execution. Deep inside medieval castles, beyond the torchlit corridors and guarded staircases, there existed chambers the public was never meant to see. These were not dungeons in the ordinary sense. They were places designed with a single purpose: to break the mind long before the body followed. Here, defeated enemies were not punished with quick suffering or visible humiliation. Instead, they were subjected to slow, deliberate methods meant to reshape their identity from the inside out. Kings who used these chambers understood something many rulers never dared to acknowledge: that fear could be engineered in silence, and obedience could be crafted through isolation more effectively than through any public display of violence. These hidden rooms were often carved deep into stone foundations, where sound was swallowed before it reached the surface. A captive taken to such a place would feel the world narrow around him. Light became a luxury. Time lost its meaning. Guards spoke in whispers or not at all. Every detail, every drip of water, every gust of cold air was part of a sensory landscape designed to disorient the enemy. While chains and darkness were common, the true torment lay in the architecture of control. Nothing happened by accident. The pacing of meals, the silence between footsteps, the unpredictable intervals of contact from the outside world, all contributed to a psychological erosion impossible to resist. Some kings preferred to use these chambers as sites of forced reflection, allowing the captive to sit alone with the knowledge of what he had lost. The weight of his downfall pressed against the walls as surely as the damp air. Days might pass with no sound but his own breathing, leaving him to replay every decision that led him there. The isolation served as a mirror, amplifying guilt, fear, and hopelessness until they became indistinguishable. Captivity in these rooms was not simply imprisonment, it was emotional excavation, peeling back layers of identity until only confusion remained. Others introduced controlled forms of sensory disruption. A captive might be kept in near darkness, then suddenly forced into blinding torchlight, left in silence, then overwhelmed by echoing metallic sounds. Allowed a moment of warmth before being plunged back into cold. These shifts destabilized the mind, creating a rhythm of unpredictability the enemy could never adapt to. Kings knew that a captive who could not anticipate the world around him was a captive who could not resist it. Each disorienting moment chipped away at the captive's perception of reality, replacing confidence with doubt and defiance with confusion. There were also chambers used for more active forms of psychological reconditioning. Here, interrogators trained to manipulate fear introduced narratives meant to reshape the captive's view of the king. They spoke of lands lost, allies defeated, families suffering consequences of rebellion. Sometimes they described punishments the captive had not yet received, letting imagination do the work of a blade. Other times they presented fabricated stories of former enemies who had submitted and found peace, creating the illusion that surrender could restore dignity. These tactics blurred the line between coercion and persuasion, turning the king into a looming presence that governed even the captive's inner thoughts. But perhaps the most effective method in these chambers was the use of other prisoners. A defeated enemy might be forced to listen as another captive broke down, wept, or begged for mercy. He might hear the slow erosion of someone else's sanity and realize the same fate awaited him. Some kings staged false releases or orchestrated moments, where a captive's hopes were briefly raised, only to be crushed moments later. Hope was the most dangerous force in these rooms, and rulers controlled it with surgical precision. By the time a captive emerged from these hidden spaces, if he emerged at all, he was changed in ways the court could scarcely imagine. His voice, his posture, his gaze carried the imprint of the world he had endured. And when he stood again in the king's presence, those who looked upon him saw not merely a defeated rival, but a man emptied and reshaped by forces they hoped never to encounter themselves. The chambers had done their work, leaving behind a figure who no longer resisted, but existed only in the shadow of the crown's authority. Some medieval kings took their cruelty to an almost theatrical level, transforming punishment into a spectacle designed to impress, terrify, and communicate power simultaneously. The act of execution or public torture became more than a necessity. It was performance, calculated to leave a permanent imprint on all who witnessed it. Courtiers, soldiers, and even visiting dignitaries became unintentional participants in a ritual of dominance. The defeated enemy was no longer merely punished, they were elevated to the status of a cautionary legend, a living warning for anyone who might consider defiance. And in these performances, the line between reality and theater was deliberately blurred, heightening the psychological impact for both captive and observer. The stage was often a courtyard, a hall, or the main square of a castle, where the enemy was placed center stage and the audience arranged around them. A captive could be chained, kneeling, or forced to display gestures of submission while the king narratively emphasized the consequences of rebellion. Every gesture and word reinforced the hierarchy. The throne was the source of absolute authority, and any resistance, however noble, was meaningless. These rituals demonstrated that power extended beyond the battlefield into the social, cultural, and even spiritual realms of the kingdom. Kings also used visual symbolism to amplify the lesson. Victims were adorned or stripped, depending on the message to be conveyed. A nobleman might be dressed in the garments of a servant or forced to hold objects associated with his previous authority, but now rendered meaningless. Execution methods were often staged to exaggerate the suffering, prolonging pain to maximize observation. The slow unfolding of punishment created suspense that amplified terror for the audience. Even the smallest gestures, the trembling of a hand, a forced bow, the trembling voice of a condemned man, were noted by all present as evidence of the king's supremacy. Another tactic was the deliberate contrast between mercy and cruelty. A captive might witness a peer's release, only to realize that their own punishment would be far worse. This manipulation of expectation reinforced uncertainty, making the audience acutely aware that the king's favor was capricious and absolute. No one could predict the next moment of wrath, and this unpredictability heightened obedience. By turning punishment into a theatrical and psychological exercise, kings embedded fear deep into the fabric of their realms, ensuring compliance without the constant use of military force. In addition, rulers often incorporated elements of narrative into these displays. Captives were made to recount their own failures aloud to explain the decisions that had led them to this humiliation. Some kings ordered chronicles of these punishments to be created, inscribed in documents, or reported verbally to traveling emissaries, spreading the message of dominance far beyond the walls of the castle. The fear generated by these performances traveled ahead of armies, discouraging rebellion before it could even take root. The psychological weight of these staged punishments was immense. Observers, whether nobles, soldiers, or servants, internalized the lesson. The king was omnipotent, and resistance was not only futile but perilous. Even distant lords who heard the stories understood that the reach of the throne extended into every corner of their lives, guiding behavior through terror as effectively as through law. The captive, too, became a living emblem of what could happen when one opposed authority. Their suffering was a message carved into memory, a warning repeated in whispers, a lesson passed through generations. If this account of medieval spectacle and calculated horror made you reflect on the depths of historical power and cruelty, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. What part of this ritualized terror shocks you most? I'd like to hear your perspective on how these kings engineered fear as a tool of control. Behind the walls of castles and fortresses, the families of defeated enemies often endured a fate as calculated and merciless as that of the prisoners themselves. Kings understood that the consequences of rebellion could not be confined to a single individual. The ripple of punishment had to reach the bloodline. By targeting family members, rulers reinforced a message that defiance was not merely personal. It threatened the very survival of one's lineage. Mothers, wives, and children could become instruments of authority, subjected to humiliation, exile, or forced relocation. These actions ensured that fear permeated every household, teaching obedience before a sword or decree was ever raised. Children of the vanquished were frequently used as pawns in the complex games of power. Some were taken to serve in royal households, stripped of their former identity and trained to forget loyalty to their family. Others were held hostage, educated in foreign customs, or forced to witness the suffering of relatives to instill a permanent understanding of the crown's dominion. The emotional toll was immense. Youth was weaponized, innocence consumed, and obedience instilled through carefully orchestrated trauma. The king's reach extended beyond physical control to mental conditioning, creating heirs whose allegiance had been forced rather than chosen, and who would carry the crown's influence far into the next generation. The destruction of family estates was another strategic measure. Lands could be confiscated, villages razed, and possessions redistributed to loyal subjects or retained by the crown. This method erased the economic power of the enemy, depriving them of wealth, influence, and the means to raise armies or rally supporters. Beyond the material, the psychological impact was profound. The defeated saw the tangible proof of the king's control over life, property, and future. Generations could be taught that resistance invited ruin, and those who survived bore the burden of their forebears' defiance. Kings also employed symbolic forms of punishment aimed at social annihilation. Marriages could be arranged or annulled to strip alliances of significance, titles revoked to erase standing, and hereditary privileges stripped to signal permanent decline. Every act reinforced the idea that the king's authority extended into every sphere of human existence, and that survival required submission. Families who once commanded respect were reduced to cautionary examples, their memory serving as a warning for those who might imagine insubordination. The collapse of familial networks created a vacuum of power that the crown could exploit, reshaping political landscapes according to the king's strategic vision. Even in exile, the shadow of the king's authority remained. Relocated families were under constant surveillance, their movements restricted, their choices dictated by servants or allies loyal to the crown. News of further punishments or rewards traveled swiftly, amplifying fear across territories. In effect, every member of a family became an instrument in the projection of royal control, their actions monitored, their behavior modeled to serve as living evidence of the consequences of rebellion. The psychological pressure was continuous, reinforcing obedience as a matter of survival rather than loyalty or principle. Through these measures, medieval rulers extended power far beyond the battlefield. By dismantling familial structures and rewriting the destiny of captured lineages, kings transformed personal defeat into a systemic tool of control. Fear became hereditary, compliance a product of survival, and the shadow of authority stretched across generations. The true genius of this strategy lay not in the immediacy of pain, but in the endurance of influence. Families reshaped, legacies rewritten, and a society conditioned to respect, fear, and obey the crown at every level. In some cases, medieval kings did not only assert their dominance over defeated enemies, they competed with one another in the art of cruelty, turning brutality into a political performance that transcended borders. Tales of punishments, mutilations, and theatrical executions traveled between courts, whispered through envoys, scribes, and merchants, creating a subtle rivalry in the demonstration of power. A king could establish his supremacy not simply by conquering lands, but by showing that his enforcement of authority was more absolute, precise, and terrifying than any rivals. The shadow of reputation became a weapon as sharp as any sword. These competitions often influenced the scale and spectacle of punishment. A ruler who had learned of another monarch executing prisoners in a particularly elaborate or symbolic way might respond by exceeding it, creating scenes of horror designed to surpass imagination. Captives could be subjected to chains, isolation, or ceremonial humiliation far beyond what practical necessity demanded, simply to prove that the king's control was unrivaled. The audience, both domestic and foreign, absorbed these messages instantly, recalibrating their perception of who held real authority and instilling fear across territories without a single additional battle. Kings also exploited the stories of rivals' cruelty to enforce obedience at home. Courtiers and nobles were reminded that while foreign rulers could impose unimaginable suffering, their own king could achieve even greater control. Tales of rival monarchs' harsh punishments became benchmarks, and captives' experiences were often compared to ensure the local population understood that resistance had no advantage. Fear became a transnational language, circulating through ambassadors, letters, and rumor, shaping political calculations before any army marched. A king who mastered the narrative could manipulate perception as effectively as armies, securing loyalty through terror and reputation alone. The rivalry extended to psychological innovation. Techniques of torture, imprisonment, and coercion evolved as rulers studied the methods of others, adapting them to their own courts. Kings observed how captives reacted to prolonged isolation, sensory manipulation, or ritualized humiliation, and adjusted the intensity or structure of their punishments accordingly. What began as a display of personal dominance often evolved into an ongoing experiment in governance through fear. Each new adaptation reinforced the idea that power was not only enforced physically, but encoded into the social and cultural consciousness, ensuring obedience far beyond the immediate moment. Additionally, competition between rulers affected the fates of families and allies. Kings understood that demonstrating power over entire lineages could surpass individual cruelty, creating a perception that no challenge was survivable. Stories circulated about entire noble families who had been dismantled or publicly shamed, sending ripples of fear that traveled to distant courts. Rulers became aware that psychological dominance over multiple generations was more effective than sporadic acts of violence. Their reputation for ruthlessness became an essential instrument of governance, influencing both allies and enemies alike. Through this lens, medieval power emerges not merely as the exercise of military might, but as a sophisticated system of calculated influence. Kings competed in cruelty, measured not by the number of enemies slain, but by the precision, symbolism, and long-lasting impact of their punishments. In this arena, fear was the currency, obedience the reward, and the spectacle of suffering a tool to shape the political and psychological landscape of entire kingdoms. Rulers understood that authority was reinforced as much by what people feared as by what they admired, and the invisible contests between monarchs created a cycle of escalation that defined the darkest aspects of medieval governance. By the time a medieval king had executed the full spectrum of his authority, from battlefield victory to psychological manipulation, from humiliation to public spectacle, the legacy of his methods extended far beyond the moment of confrontation. Every enemy defeated, every family shattered, every ritualized punishment left traces that echoed across generations. The strategies of fear, control, and theatrical cruelty were not random. They were instruments of governance carefully honed to preserve dominion and shape the perception of power. Kings understood that absolute authority required mastery not only of armies and territories, but of minds and memories. Even the smallest townsfolk understood that the reach of the crown extended beyond walls, dungeons, and battlefields, touching every decision and every thought. The consequences of defiance were lived stories, circulating through whispers and chronicles, reinforcing obedience as a condition of survival. These methods shaped not only the immediate kingdom, but also the broader cultural understanding of monarchy, creating a psychological blueprint that rulers would follow for centuries. The crown became an object of fear, its decisions immortalized through spectacle and narrative, and the lives of the defeated became part of an ongoing lesson in submission. By witnessing these events, nobles, soldiers, and citizens alike internalized the mechanics of power. Authority could be absolute, and resistance could be repurposed into a cautionary tale that strengthened the throne. Across courts, these actions were studied, adapted, and replicated, creating a legacy of terror that intertwined with law, tradition, and political strategy. History remembers these kings not only for their victories, but for the indelible mark they left on human behavior. And yet, even in the midst of such pervasive cruelty, lessons emerge about the complexity of power and the human psyche. Observing the calculated measures of medieval rulers reveals not only their capacity for violence, but their understanding of obedience, manipulation, and the delicate balance between fear and respect. Authority was maintained, not solely through force, but through the orchestration of perception, the management of expectations, and the careful design of consequences. The defeated became instruments in a system where fear and spectacle coexisted, teaching both subjects and enemies the cost of defiance while reinforcing the legitimacy of the crown. If you followed this journey through the shadows of medieval courts, take a moment to reflect and share your thoughts in the comments below. Type, "This message was for me," if the depth of these historical realities resonated with you. Don't forget to leave a like to help others discover the hidden mechanisms of power, and make sure you're subscribed so you can continue exploring these dark chapters of history with us. And for those curious to see how these patterns evolved in other kingdoms and eras, there's a video right next to this one that dives even deeper. Click and continue the exploration to uncover more of the strategies, spectacles, and secrets that shaped empires long ago.